Hello, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much to Jenny Hall and Jenny Booth, my friend, who I've known since I was 11, for creating the links for me to come and speak to you today. And it feels so appropriate that it's about celebrating 50 years of inclusion here at Edinburgh Napier, because for me, it feels like when you read that out, it feels like I was smiling because it feels like somebody else's story. If you'd have told me 10 years ago, even 3 years ago, I'd be asked to speak at NASA, I would have thought you must be on another planet, quite appropriately. But, you know, the whole reason I'm here is because of all the work that everyone has done incrementally over the years, and I know it carries on, to increase our understanding of what inclusion means. I mean, particularly, there's obviously visible and invisible disabilities, and using the wheelchair kind of places me in a particular position of having a visible disability. And it's been an amazing experience to use an arts practice to research and understand the changes I went through when I started using a wheelchair. And I really can't emphasize enough how much that inclusion for me has been based on people's attitudes, people's willingness all along the way. I mean, particularly when I started talking about the idea of using a wheelchair underwater, that there was most people, you know, it just was too out of left field, and it didn't seem possible, probable or relevant. And it's all along the way, they've been those people who've engaged with my schemes, and I've managed to talk and communicate and develop the ideas and develop the argument. So I would now say it's a gift of having acquired a disability, and the privilege of a fine arts education, because the combination of that process of research to break down and explore what happened in the way I experienced quite a dramatic change in people's attitudes towards me when I started using the wheelchair. And so the gift of the privilege of an arts education has enabled me to research and break it down and understand, and come to see that it's a series of attitudes and taken for granted preconceptions that exist, that it seemed through the research that the concepts most people came up with when you asked them about a wheelchair were words such as fear, pity, restriction, limitation, illness, and so on. But for me, from the first moment I used a wheelchair, if anyone's seen the TED Talk, apologies, you're about to, this will be familiar to you. But I say it all the time, because for me, the first moment I used a wheelchair, it just gave me the most tremendous sense of freedom. I'd lost my mobility over a couple of years prior to that, 2 or 3 years. And so somebody, and I can't remember how come somebody brought a power chair to my house to try. And I can remember to this day that feeling of going down the street and then along the road that I'd hardly seen. And the thing I always say is the feeling of the wind on my face was incredible. And I was going, brilliant, I can be back out in the world again. There's this amazing piece of equipment. Obviously, this is probably wheelchair number 4 now. Amazing piece of equipment that's going to get me out there. But then when I finally started managing to get back out into society, it was, I was going, hello, I'm back. And people go, oh, I'm really sorry you're in a wheelchair. And I was going, no. It's like internally, I was going, no, the wheelchair is why I'm able to be here. And I say that because those stereotypes can have, and anyone involved in inclusion and working to move that forward will completely understand this, but they really do have a big impact on people's identity. Luckily, I'd worked in a long-term specialist mental health team, and I had quite a lot of skills in terms of building back out into life as I kind of found ways forwards through an arts practice, believing in the therapeutic power of art. But for many people, those skills aren't necessarily available. So the thing I've come to understand is that if we, I'm going to digress. through my research, I read this brilliant article called The Disability of Thinking the Disabled Body by Lee Davis Creel. It was a master's paper. And it had a profound influence on me because she talks about her brother who has cerebral palsy and the way people had tried to, through his physiotherapy, to be more normal, to walk more normally, talk more normally. And at some point he was in a seminar, and somebody mimicked his voice, which was a real shock to him. But this person said, "Why are you trying to be other than you are?" And he said the scales fell from his eyes. So it was that first understanding those pressures to be normal and what impact they can have on people's identity unintentionally. He ended up with post-traumatic stress disorder, he realised later in his life, from the training he'd received, which was all completely positively intended as a child, the physio he'd received as a child. But the other part of that article was to talk about the power of taking control of our own narratives. And if my PowerPoint had worked, there would be a quote about the power of the nexus of power and control that creates the disabled as other is challenged in personal challenged in personal narratives. And so you can see that experience of my I can't emphasize how strong the experience was of this is my freedom, I can be back in the world. Still to this day, my enabler Becky, who's with us, will know that I go along laughing, kind of really enjoying the chair, and I have an adapted vehicle, and that pretty much every day, I mean, I've been using it since 2001, I go, this is such an amazing bit of kit, and generally, particularly engineers and mechanics, find it really fascinating to come and look at it and talk about it and understand what's been constructed. But you can see how that process of having such a strong impact, the wheelchair having such a strong impact on my sense of freedom and being able to be out in the world again, combined with the theoretical research that understood that it's just about attitudes that are in society that we absorb without thinking about it, that have an impact on people's identities when they start to need to use one, and potentially on people's reaction to somebody in a wheelchair. Though, I mean, now I never notice it anymore. I think I'm so comfortable in my chair. One of the things people say to me is they don't see me as disabled, because I'm not quite sure what they mean, but I understand the intention. And then this process of creating narratives, and then I had this tremendous moment of, so backtracking again, so as a way of building it back out into life, I believed in the therapeutic power of art because of working in a long-term specialist mental health team and seeing how powerful that can be, and having completed a person-centred art therapy counselling course prior to starting working in the mental health team. And so I went on this journey of helping myself build back out into life, and I had no idea it was going to lead here, I have to say, or to NASA, or to Stanford University, or I'm due to speak at the European Parliament on the 3rd of December and hang an exhibition there, and Microsoft just got in touch to ask me to be part of an advert for the Super Bowl series. So these strange things happen, but you can see how all these things come together for me to then suddenly see that this arts practice, I think at one point I was thinking, but what use can I be as an individual artist within society? Because my role previously within a mental health team, I could see what impact and what effect that was having, and that was meaningful to me, and perhaps that's not relevant to other people, but for me, I come from a family where there's a great sense of service and involvement and being integrated, or that your work could in some ways build social capital. That's how I understand it now, building social capital. And so I was watching the work of an artist called Bill Shannon, who dances on crutches and a skateboard. And and through his practice, first of all, he was exploring his own personal experience, but through the impact of seeing his imagery, the effect it had on my sense of identity in terms of thinking, it's valuable to explore one's own experience and create narratives about that. Tied in with the article I mentioned to you about by Lee Davis Creel about if we take control. I didn't bring the link back round, but if you can create narratives about your own experience, and if all of us create narratives about our own experience, that increases the inclusivity and builds that strength in society, I believe, because then when other people are facing those issues for the first time, there are probably the weight of stereotypes that do exist, and sort of they're changing but they carry on, but you've got these alternative, powerful, life-enhancing narratives that hopefully say disability, difference, not deficit. It's this thing about, and the gift I would say about acquiring a disability is you look at the world from a very different perspective, and that means that different perspective, if you're in a position of valuing that and exploring it and being really interested in it, rather than thinking this is a really negative experience because society tells me I've lost A, B, C, D and through to Z, if you look at that with that different perspective, then you find unexpected solutions. And I think that's been a very, I really can't, if I could choose to go back to before I had started using the chair, and if I had to lose everything I'd learned, I couldn't choose to go back if it meant losing everything that I've learned through that process. So I think the combination and inclusivity is at the heart of that whole experience, because at every stage there's been somebody with who's been prepared to work with me, or at the start it was before this practice started, I was working with some painted glasswork, and I started receiving commissions, and they travelled out around the world, and I was looking at how to turn that into a business, because when I was at my most unwell, it was really important that I had a table over my bed and I could do a few minutes at a time, but it felt like I was creating a commission this could lead back into work at some point, which seemed a very distant thing. But so I'd started on that particular road, and somebody happened to, and I was looking at a way, once I got my adapted van, to try and be able to work more regularly. So I'd asked for advice from somebody through, I think, a disability assessor. And they just kept on saying to me, I think you're too unwell to do that at the moment, but have you considered higher education? Because the Disabled Students grant creates very good access to, if you want to pursue that route. And at the time, this was several years before, I didn't think anything more of it, but various things happened, and I did one course and another course, and then eventually people kept on saying, I think you should do a degree. So I remembered that information, and the Disabled Students Allowance has been transformative for me. The process of having the assessment and having various issues identified I hadn't even thought about was very constructive. It turns out I have acquired dyslexia, which was very helpful to find out, because I hadn't understood why things had changed so much in the way I could access the written word. And actually that's, for me, it's, if disability is about when I say I'm disabled, I'm not talking about my impairment, I'm talking about the physical and attitudinal barriers I face in society. And from that perspective, I actually find the written word much more of a barrier than using the chair, because physical access has improved so much. But so, sorry, I've just lost my thread for a second there. Access. So that process of the Disabled Students Allowance, besides identifying, it identified issues that I wasn't even aware of, which was really helpful. but it had solutions. And just to give you an example, I've had the experience of it. The first time around, it didn't happen very well. The second time around, it was amazing. The first time around, the assessment, and I didn't have the resources at the time to challenge this. And it's just to give you an overview that it can work, can go wrong, and it can work really well. But the person assessing me assessed me for a special seat and a computer. And at the time, I said, "Look, I think I'm only going to be able to work lying down in bed." And they were saying, "No, this chair is going to be so good, it'll be like being in bed." I still can't move that chair. And Becky and I this is 2003, it's 11 years later, and I'm a lot stronger. And so I really struggled for that first year without the appropriate assessment, and I could have challenged it, and I did try and challenge it, but when you're in that position that so much has happened and just living is very, very challenging, it's really hard to find the energy to reshape things. So I think that's really I was asked to speak about various things, and that's one of the things to be really aware of, I think, that particularly if people have very complex and challenging needs and have issues about energy, I think a great deal of care needs to be taken in the assessment process. And in the mental health team I worked in, we had the luxury of being allowed 3 to 6 months for our assessment process. But so I really struggled, and then at some point I managed to buy my own laptop, and my practice started taking off. And then I moved to Plymouth University, to the main campus, and I had a reassessment. And the chap was amazing. He, because I was a distance student, he jumped through all sorts of hoops. Nigel Larkin-Williams, he transformed my life. Disability assessor, amazing guy. Because he broke all the rules. He organised, he fought, he campaigned with the local LEA so that I could employ someone directly, so they could come to my home and drive me down to Plymouth. At the time that wasn't allowed. People had to be employed by the university, so they couldn't come to your home. Without that, I just wouldn't have been there in the first place. Even with that, it was a struggle when I got there. And the additional learning support turned out to be essential. But all of this weaves through this process of an artistic practice. It's completely woven in this research process of, at the same, while dealing with those physical, finding ways to overcome the physical, understand, because the other thing is you don't necessarily understand what the barriers are, because in one's mind, one is, I think this is different if you're born with a disability, but acquiring a disability, there's still part of my mind that thinks I can do things in the time I used to do before I acquired a disability, and I was pretty speedy, we could say, before. So it's, Nigel Larkin-Williams was absolutely amazing, and then the staff on the fine art course at Plymouth University were amazing, because although there'd been a slight failure in the link in terms of I was supposed to get all the lecture notes and so on ahead of time, they were so flexible and pragmatic, and I think compassionate would be the right kind of word. It just came down to their attitude again. They were inclusive. It was an attitude that enabled them to be inclusive without me even noticing it. They just naturally adapted. And that's the best kind of inclusion. It happens because it's a positive desire for everyone to be included. I've had experiences of attending meetings and you go, oh no, I've got to sort the access out now. Oh goodness, I'm going to be causing trouble for people, and it's that sense of it being an extra hassle for people for me to be there. And so when it just happens so naturally and it's completely integrated, it changes how you feel about being part of an event. And that, I think, that just naturally evolves through ideas and attitudes evolving in society. But so the wheelchair, how did we get to an underwater wheelchair, and how did we get to a flying wheelchair? It in 2005, and again, apologies if you've seen the TED Talk, in 2005, so I'd been having this struggle, so everything had fallen into place, so I was actually physically able to get to uni. It was a big struggle, and I've never worked so hard in my life, actually, I have to say, just to be there. But it was wonderful to be there, and it was wonderful to be met with such understanding and such a creative. I think I'm so glad I was doing fine art as my second degree, because they had such an amazing approach to including me, and it was just who I was, because they are naturally inclusive, and many art students are exploring aspects of their personal experience. They just naturally included that and immediately saw it as a useful area for me to be working with. So I'd been presenting various pieces of work that included the wheelchair and consistently got this response, but it's too obvious. And I go, but you're not getting it. And what do they mean by obvious? And then so I started this research I mentioned and discovered these words that almost everyone, if I would ask, just have a simple piece of paper saying, please could you write down the first 3 words that come to mind when I mention NHS wheelchair, and 70% of the words were the kind of life-limiting or restricting words in some kind of way that I mentioned. And so I was thinking, how on earth am I going to overcome this? And I retrained as a disabled diver in 2005. And I just had that eureka moment when I made the link that scuba gear extends your range of activity in exactly the same way a wheelchair does, but the associations attached to scuba gear are ones of excitement and adventure. And so I had this thought, I wonder what will happen if I put the two together. And it took quite a few years to persuade anyone, first of all, to work with me underwater with a wheelchair, because of no, wheelchairs and water don't mix, which they don't too well. You have to take quite a lot of care. And the chair, I'm on Mark 5. My last chair came a cropper when it needed some emergency welding, and developed the previous chair, should I say. I now do have another. I have a rebuilt chair, but steel and water, I can assure you, really don't mix. But so just that journey of moving from having the idea to then working with people, it's a process of conversation and communication and inspiring, having an idea yourself, believing in it, because I think through seeing Bill Shannon's work, the thing I'd come to understand is an arts practice. And through various other trainings, I did some amazing training with an organisation called SYNC on cultural leadership. And I came to understand that through an arts practice, you can create cultural leadership. And I realised I'd lost a section of my life in terms of I knew the wheelchair was my freedom, but the impact of those narratives had an impact on my identity, even though I had more skills, or I had the background that I had, put me in a much stronger position than many people to first of all deal with social services and all the different agencies I needed to deal with to organise support. And I realised I was in a stronger position than many people, having been on the other side of those services and provided them in the past. And it was still a massive struggle for me, an incredible struggle actually. And so I realised that actually that process of creating narratives can build social capital in and of its own right. I came to understand that process of talking about ideas and communicating ideas and just showing what can happen when you think from a different perspective can both empower but excite and inspire people. And it's that process of raising that energy that somehow through this strange experience, this whole amazing array of things that have happened, that it has given me this amazing toolbox of ideas and energy and concepts to play with and communicate. And I'm going to quickly bring it back round. None of that would have happened without inclusion. because Plymouth University was absolutely amazing. The Disabled Students Grant was absolutely amazing. Things started happening with my practice once I'd created an image of me sitting underwater in my NHS wheelchair in a summer dress with my hair flying up, which was used all across the South Bank during Unlimited in 2012. It was used as their main image. And somehow that image started a work in the world that it just feels like my responsibility to carry on. I just feel like people think it's me doing this work, but my experience is there's this amazing energy of concepts and ideas that builds on and links in to the work so many other people are doing, you know, as you're doing here at Edinburgh, celebrating 50 years of inclusion. It's brilliant. If you know, I'm an example of what could happen from all that work and commitment. And in facilitating me to engage and study and gain, first through undergraduate and then postgraduate study, what's happened is it's created an artwork that has, as I was saying, has an energy. And my responsibility is just to keep calm and kind of, when Microsoft get in touch or NASA get in touch or the European Parliament get in touch, stay calm and go, right, okay. You know, for myself, one of the most scary moments of my life was the night before I spoke at NASA. I was completely rewriting the talk because I'd learned it was the trip of a lifetime, but I'd learned so much in the couple of days beforehand, which was supposed to be rest days. But I just knew I needed to rewrite the talk because theirs is the ultimate different perspective. So I was up all night rewriting it. And for myself, it would have been absolutely the last thing I would have wanted to do was do that talk. But the artwork needed the energy that it holds and takes out into the world, needed me to do that. And so I feel like as if I'm proselytizing, but that's my experience. It's created an energy of its own, and I just have to try and keep up. And the other amazing thing about it is the people and I'm smiling at Becky at the back of the room here, is the amazing people it draws in, because it's so out of left field that our dive instructor who jumped in the pool with me to build the underwater wheelchair, it was like we went up to him and an arts officer had given me a contact to say, well, there's a chap I know who's a dive instructor, but I know he had a background within the arts in the past. And we went to speak to him and he was like, right, okay, when are we starting? And my Trish Wheatley, who's my co-producer, who was my enabler on the MA, and she said she did the MA with me at Plymouth to get the MA she should have had. She'd already completed an MA, but it had been a very disrupted course, I think. And there was my tutor there, Sarah Bennett, she's so incisive and has such good critical analysis, but she just puts she feeds you exactly the right academic references. She understands, for example, for me it was autoethnography, which is this process of exploring your own experience and then creating narratives that from the personal to the universal. So you look at your own personal experience and then find out how that has relevance or creates a route out into the world that other people might use. But going back, the team are absolutely amazing. So, and that's another example that they're inclusive through their attitudes. They're already thinking outside the box for them to be attracted to and want to work with the project, which is what keeps on happening. So I'd got to the point of having this idea of a wheelchair underwater. It took 2 years before I managed to get the photograph. We worked with a photographer who we mentioned the idea to when I was on another dive trip in Egypt. He went, oh, that's fine, yeah, okay, I'll organise the pool. Jumped in the pool, 325 photos, just one stood out. It was just that moment of seeing it. But that photo created an energy within the art department, and I diverted in the meantime to paint with my wheelchair. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show you the slides, but I created this looping white set of tracks through Plymouth for my degree show, which created quite a stir. Over 4.5 kilometres, and through a whole series of instances I believed I had full permission, and I had partial permission, but it turned out I actually didn't have permission to paint across the roads, so it caused quite a big debate. But the lovely thing was that people of all ages would run and dance along those lines, so for me I was leaving a trace of my joy and freedom, and a trace of my joy and freedom became a conceptual presence and physical presence in people's minds as they played along those lines. And it was used, and I created those lines using the white paint that's used to mark out fields of play. So you can see this layering that happens through an arts practice that then is relevant to inclusion, because I think there's a similar process that goes on, that you start from one point, because with each person, what inclusion it to be inclusive for one person is totally the opposite for another. So you have to start from the beginning with each person, and it's a process of engagement and building up and working out what could be possible. And if that goes, if you find the keys for that individual person, you just don't know what potential might be unlocked. And I'm just aware of the time and that we have some films to show. I'll just try and speed through really quickly to say white lines. Now I started painting with turned my wheelchair into a paint wheelchair and filmed from it. And in the meantime, I was carrying that on while I'd had the idea of the underwater wheelchair, and we got the photos, because that was kind of happening outside of the actual degree. And then through the reaction to the underwater wheelchair, I then applied for, so the other key partner in this journey has been the Arts Council, because I then applied for research and development funding through the Arts Council to create an underwater wheelchair. And I'm amazed they gave me, I have to say, as I say it now, I'm completely amazed they had the belief to take the risk to say, okay, we'll give you some funding to see if it's possible. And the plan was always to apply for an unlimited commission if it did prove possible, but we really had no idea. I was fairly sure it could happen. I thought about it a lot over the previous 5 years. It was 2010 when I got the commission. And we assembled a group of people, we jumped in a pool, it was literally build a little, test a little, fly a little, as they said at NASA, one of those ways round. We literally jumped in the pool. Cable ties and duct tape were a very important part of the process. We bolted on we found this special Pegasus dive propulsion vehicle that was appropriate, and then I designed some fins, and I worked out, I was waiting for somebody to provide a pivot for me to use those fins, and then I had this another eureka moment of working out I could just swap my fins round. And it just literally, to start with, I was in a dive suit with using a button in my hand, and because of that combination of the intention, which was to create surreal, as you mentioned, surreal juxtapositions that might have the power to excite and inspire. Because there was an artistic reason or research process guiding the development of the work, it helped shape and push the idea further and further, because it wasn't just about creating a wheelchair that would fly underwater, it was about creating dramatic and unexpected imagery that used. Previously, I'd been working with the semiotics of advertising, so the way people might make a car look very glamorous and desirable. I was deliberately using those kind of, or hoping to use those kind of processes. And so that required, in the end, I worked out, we tried all sorts of outfits, and I suddenly realised I really did need to dive in a dress to make, which has been a tough decision actually. I've, on my first few dives, diving even in Egypt, that meant I needed to dive in Egypt, and one of those moments when I sat up in bed and went, I've got to dive in the most beautiful environment I can possibly find, and it wasn't funded, so we'd got the research and development bid, we'd proved that wheelchair would work, it had got to a certain stage of being really from the beginning, what is incredibly basic to me now, people were getting very excited about. and yes, very, very excited about, really right from the beginning, just because it was so unexpected. But to me, that is incredibly basic work now. But when that process of developing the aesthetic, so we created the underwater wheelchair, and I was applying for the Unlimited Commission, and in that process we were intending to film in Britain, and I had this moment of going, no, we have to go to Egypt, and we found the money. We through Camel, where I trained, sponsored us. We got everything for cost price. The team all volunteered, so something that was impossible became possible because of everyone's commitment to making the image, to making the work possible, their belief. And that's been the story all along the way. And the Arts Council, an amazing relationship officer, Ruth Carpagia, was saying, but art is about looking at the world from a different perspective, and creating imagery that enables other people to explore that particular way of looking at the world. For me personally, it's also about creating a thinking space. So it's not necessarily about a traditional practice which would be about physical objects and images in the world. For me, those images are secondary. They serve the process of creating a thinking space that enables people to engage in whatever way people engage. That's valuable. So the person who repeatedly says on web forums, but she would be much more free without her wheelchair, and other people come back and say, there was a debate went on, and in the end somebody said, you've completely missed the point. She's saying she is free in the wheelchair. Her wheelchair is the point, that her freedom, and you're showing the preconceptions that have led her to do the work. But to me, that's a completely valid response, because somebody's still going on a journey. Unlimited. So we got the commission, sorry, I'm aware I'm kind of, it's just such a massive project. It's really, I'm not even scratching the surface for you. We got the commission and started refining the aesthetic, managed to get out to Egypt. That required further adaptations to the wheelchair for open water rather than being in a pool or being in cold water in Britain. And more people becoming involved with wanting to spread the message. And one thing I would also say, because the artwork is conceptual and about ideas, now you have the idea, and I really think I should cut to playing the films in a minute, but now you have the idea of an underwater wheelchair in your mind, and particularly when you talk about it to other people, I would argue that you all become part of the artwork, because then you become part of the way in which it spreads out into the world. And I've had some debates about that, with my tutor, about how that operates in terms of an artistic practice. But that's what I see, that inclusion, the Arts Council, the Disabled Students Allowance, all the organisations that have chosen to believe and support and believe in the idea of transforming preconceptions, because disability is one thing, it's relevant to all of us. Most of us will experience if only through the aging process, and therefore if you create narratives where people can move quickly to that point of saying it's a different life, it's not less of a life, then you save all that energy that has within the team. We know of examples of people who get completely trapped in those narratives and can become very bitter and angry, and that not only is their life lost, but it causes a great deal of damage for people around them. And I would say that happens because of the weight of those preconceptions. And the other thing, I haven't even touched on the flying wheelchair, but the other thing is that not only do if those negative ideas settle into somebody and it shapes the way they engage with the world, that it's a kind of, it's I can't think of the right word, it's a loss of energy or potential or possibility that can echo and increase in a way, hopefully, this process of exploring it and finding the positive and seeing the amazing changes that has brought for me can have a corresponding positive echo. And I would say now that although it started off with transforming preconceptions about the wheelchair, for me, I've come to understand it's all of us have life-changing events. You know, every single one of us at some point in our life, I would imagine almost every single one of us, should I say, faces some kind of major life event. And I think that, and for me that happened to be becoming disabled. But I think that the value of thinking about looking from a different perspective echoes for any part of life, and it's at the heart of inclusivity. So I think, and that has now led to a commission to create a flying wheelchair, which I have to say is proving to be very challenging and quite a scary process, and we don't know yet whether it's going to be possible, but I'm learning to fly, and I'm flying a tandem flexwing microlight, which is the most exciting experience. It's amazing. So I kind of have these pinch me moments when I go. I have moments of terror as before when I was about to speak at NASA, and I think before I speak at the European Parliament in a few days' time. But then I have these other pinch me moments when my team are gathered around me, we're diving in Egypt, we're on this, I'm going into a loop, because the other thing about the chair now is it loop-the-loops. It's just incredible. And I would say it's actually a greater sense of freedom than flying. And I wasn't expecting that. I was thinking flying would have a greater sense of freedom. But I can't loop-the-loop in a flexwing microlight. Apparently, unfortunately, somebody told me it has been done. So it's now in my brain. And my instructor keeps on saying to me, you can't do that. You don't do... our videographer who heard I wanted to fly a wheelchair and said, yes, you can do that. I import paramotors into Britain. And I thought, oh, brilliant. And he has this little model called Robin. It's a little so paramotoring is when you have a wing and a motor on your back and you run and take off. I'm going to paratrike, which means you use wheels, but I'm going to create one that looks, when you look up, it's going to primarily look like a wheelchair flying through the air. You go, what's a wheelchair doing up there? But Robin is a little paramotor toy, and he can do beautiful spiral dives and beautiful loop-the-loops. So I'm sure if a scale model can do, obviously need to start talking to engineers. But anyway, I think I should let you see a little bit of what I've been talking about. Watching this, the wheelchair gives me so much more freedom than normal diving, in case there are any divers in the audience.
Does that have the two legs of things under it?
Yes, yeah.
They're the big fast.
Yeah. And you can't quite see them yet, but I have two big height planes that, because I have some use of my legs, I'm steering motors, so it means I can steer in either direction. And the fin at the back, when we put the 2 Pegasus thrusters on, it started looping the loop because there was so much power around the centre of gravity. And so I worked out I needed to increase the angle of the fins to keep myself stable in the water. But it was so boring after loop the looping. So the actual fin at the back that you can possibly just see it's adjustable, so I can have it in a stable position for a level flight. But I've since developed I never have it. I always have it in acrobatic mode because I've since developed a way of using the motors where I can drop down. When it was so powerful, I had to have my foot plates completely pointed down to stay level. So the only way I could go down was to lose air, reduce my buoyancy, which was a bit too harsh and sudden. So to be able to get back to steer, I needed the full range of my feet, the full range of the fins to be able to steer down and up. And we originally did it, as I said, by setting the fins at an angle, but then but I lost some of the acrobatic quality, so this is a great compromise. So it's just an ongoing research process and an interaction between the physical practicalities and the artistic intention and the support and the ideas of people around me. So it's this quite a complex dance. At that point, I could, for some reason, the motors weren't powerful enough in Egypt to do a full loop the loop, but I've since done a new adaptation to the chair, which adds an extra layer of buoyancy underneath that happened by accident, and now I hang upside down even. It's amazing, quite incredible.
But not with a frock on.
Oh, actually, do you know, I do, yes, because it took, although it looks like a normal dress, the dress itself took a great deal of work. There's, I have managed to squeeze a very thin shorty under there because I was pretty much hypothermic in my first dives in March when I came out in Egypt. It was, I kind of come out going, which silly person decided to wear a dress to dive in Egypt in March? But just the dress, there's these special loops and there's extra material and you have to go through all this process of tucking it in and controlling it. And again, the team have great attention to detail, so they'll notice if a bit's going to flap out and it ruins the shot, and the belts have to be tucked in. And I've actually got it, I'm literally welded into the seat. Our support diver, Tamer, from Camel Dive Club in Egypt, where I trained and where all the divings happened, he's literally, it's hidden under the dress. We pull the dress back and hide it. So the waist strap looks like a normal belt, but it's actually kind of really belted into the chair, and then this is the extra one. But yes, even the dress was quite a process of development. But the next film was an additional commission that happened while we were creating this work. I was asked to create a film for the Paralympic Flame Festivals with absolutely no direction at all as to what I should achieve. So I chose to create the narrative of I was thinking torch underwater, how can I make sense of this? So it became a search for liberating and bringing it back to the surface. And this was with our first videographer, Norman, who did some amazing work for us. And he moved away, and he was just starting to work as a videographer. He had been an international sports photographer, and so that was amazing to work with him. And this is his edit. The previous film is my edit, because film is very much part of my practice. But there's... shall I stop talking so you can play the music? and again, I've just, such a technical achievement to create the, working with all the team to create the wheelchair to create the torch flaming underwater. It had been done previously, but with a real flame, but we didn't quite manage that for this for this project. But again, everyone working together, thinking things through. It happened incrementally in stages, and it completely messed up our schedules for Unlimited because it wasn't. We had a very tight schedule anyway, but it was a kind of commission you couldn't turn down really. And we had one of only, I think there were 4 or 5 Paralympic torches in existence at the time, and we'd promised we'd look after it very carefully, and we'd just texted to say everything was fine after, because we checked it the previous night and put it away in its beautiful bag that it came with. And so Trish had just texted to say everything was fine, and then we got it out and it was the forgotten the name of a thin layer of metal was peeling off, and we were kind of looking at one of only 4 or 5 in the world thinking we've damaged the Paralympic torch. Do we have time to show a teeny bit of fledgling flights? This is very different. I kind of wish this film wasn't here, because this is fine. With the underwater wheelchair, people only saw the finished article. They saw the beautiful refined footage, well, hopefully the refined finished footage that we intended to show. With this project, with this commission, somebody approached me when they heard I was going to NASA. Somebody approached me to say, we want you to be aware that there's potentially a commission available for creating imagery of wheelchairs in space, if you could. And I said, yes, we've been thinking of that. And in fact, we've been joking about NASA filming at the neutral buoyancy lab in NASA for 2 years. So when they got in touch, it was partly NASA and partly, well, of course they would. So I was saying to the space, actually, I was saying, well, I am intending to create imagery of wheelchairs in space eventually, but that's the third part of the narrative. I want to fly a wheelchair first, and thought no more of it. And the day after I'd organised with somebody who was going to train me in his spare time in evening and weekends, because in the meantime I'd had interest about creating something for the Brazil 2016 Olympics. It really keeps on happening like this. So the day after I'd organised that, because it normally takes 2 years to follow things, at least 2 years to develop a project, they got back in touch and said, okay, flying wheelchair for 2014, wheelchairs in space for 2016. But this project, I think, I had the hardest time I've ever had out in France, and it's quite a tough film. It's a tough film for me to watch, and we sent it to the space not expecting them to put it up and saying, we know it's longer than you want, it's 28 minutes, but we want you to see it like this, and then you can choose if you cut it up. They chose to put it up as it was because the producer said he was watching like this through his hands. But I think this film chooses to show the barriers you can meet, and the fact the work, you then sidestep and keep going and find ways. Just because one person doesn't think it's possible, you can invariably, if you keep talking and thinking and working out solutions, you invariably find someone who does. So the whole underlies inclusivity as well.
Doesn't seem to want to play.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
Try one more time.
Well,
just try one more time. That's good now.
Yes. I'm just wondering if it would be worth, because basically you're going to see a lot of me ground handling and then doing 2 takeoffs, and then it ends with me rolling, having a little bit of a crash. So I wonder if it would be worth moving it, I don't know if it'll allow you to move it to about 2/3 of the way through. You could move it a teeny bit further. until you're not going to see where it is until, yeah. So basically, I hadn't realised that I hadn't realised that I also have, when you're working at this level and trying to control a big engine behind your back with one hand and brake and control, it's like a wild animal over your head, I have to say. And the person training me was saying from day 3 I wouldn't be able to do it. So, but I think for the very best reasons, that he's ex-military and was really trying to check that I really, really wanted to do this. And I have to say now I think it's completely nuts to train solo, as you do on paratrikes, in Britain, first of all, and I've gone back to training tandem on a flex-wing microlight, which is quite a bit harder, but when I go back to training on a paratrike, my reactions hopefully will be much faster. But it's not, we don't know I'll be able to do it yet. So it's but I think if you do ever watch this film online, I think at the end I say something. I've had a very, very, very hard time and a real grilling, which most of it doesn't make it into the film. But I say, no, don't let people trample on your dreams. There's always a way through. So if you would like to look at that at some point online, that would. Let's see, I'm just wondering if one of these is going to be the takeoff. Sorry?
We got covered, that's
Yes. Yes, when the wing comes down like that, I was thinking, oh my goodness, because there's not much once you start. If your wing overflies you and the engine's running, you can completely, it was the complete thing you must never do, because it can go then back through the motors and it melts the wing on the engine, and yes, absolutely don't do it. It was just a shock. I'm just hoping we might get through to the part where I think it'll hopefully happen next, where you do actually see me take off. But I took off never having landed, which I do think my current instructor watched the film and he said that was very helpful. I now know how to train you, but I think that's completely ridiculous way to train, to take off not having landed before. But a beautiful location. We had to go to the south of France to a place, this is Charbon Ridge in the background, because the weather just wasn't good enough in Britain. Just wait and see if this is a takeoff. Thank you very much.